History in the making. Detroit files Chapter 9, the largest municipal bankruptcy in history. What will happen now? How does it affect the people who live not only in the city, but across the state of Michigan? You'll hear from the governor and Kevin Orr. It's all right now on MiWeek.
Michigan's turnaround is being powered by things we do better than anywhere else in the world. Today's global leaders routinely turn to Michigan to work on their most difficult problems. That's because the engineering talent in this part of the world is simply the best. So many possibilities lie ahead for Michigan's future. These opportunities are here and starting to happen. The vision for the new Michigan. Share it, talk it up, drive it home. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Good evening, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. It was the announcement we didn't want to hear but had a gut feeling would come, and it is making headlines around the world. Detroit is officially the largest city in history to file for bankruptcy. Years of borrowing, a dwindling tax base, billions in debt. We now know what rock bottom looks like. This morning, Emergency Manager Kevin Orr announced the Chapter 9 municipal bankruptcy filing.
We didn't make this decision improvidently or in haste. This has been a decision that in one fashion or another has been working its way to the city for the better part of 6 decades. We're finally at a point where we simply cannot kick the can down the road any further. We must address these issues and restore services to the citizens of the city.
Governor Snyder says this is a new beginning for the city. I had a chance to speak with him and Kevin Orr a short time after the announcement. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on MiWeek. Governor Snyder, I'd like to start with you. When did that phone call come in from Kevin this week saying that he wanted to file for bankruptcy, and what was that conversation between the two of you like?
Well, we've had ongoing meetings, so this wasn't a surprise by any means. Kevin held his creditors meeting June 14th or so and basically set a 30-day kind of timetable to see what kind of response he would get. Those 30 days had gone by, so we were having regular discussions. On Tuesday night, I received an email from him with a recommendation to move forward with the bankruptcy. We met on Wednesday, we had extensive discussions, and on Thursday we were going through the preparation, did the letter. I thought it was the appropriate thing to do. A very difficult decision because, again, you're talking about many people involved in this process, but this is the right thing to do because there was no viable alternative. So I went ahead and authorized the filing. Kevin did the filing, and now it's time to move forward and get Detroit stabilized and grow Detroit.
And Kevin, obviously not a very easy process. Chapter 9 of this magnitude is really uncharted territory. What are your biggest concerns going forward in the process? And do you think lawsuits are going to be a problem in delaying this process?
No, I mean, one of the things that Chapter 9 is designed to do is to stem the lawsuits. That's why there's an automatic stay and to bring everybody to the table. It also starts from a doctrinal purpose of setting out the obligations that the municipality has, which is to provide services for the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens as a priority. So we are trying to anticipate some of the objections that may come. That's typical in these types of cases. We've seen them before in other large cases. We filed today a motion to set out a scheduling order so that there'll be a process by which people can file objections. We'll file responses, and we'll have our eligibility to file going forward. And then we're going to have a discussion regarding a plan of adjustment that we're going to try to get to certainly before the end of the year.
So, Kevin, Detroiters can expect their city services. What do you say to pensioners today who see these headlines, Detroit in bankruptcy, and what can they expect now?
Well, what I say to pensioners, first of all, is we have no plans to change anything from the status quo for the balance of this year with regard to any of those obligations. But I also say to them, though, is I understand and am sensitive, highly sensitive to the concerns. I appreciate the fact that this is scary, but the reality is we've been coming this way for the past several decades, more acutely just in the past 8 years. In 2005, we borrowed $1.5 billion, which was supposedly to close the pension gap and solve the problem, and it didn't do it. And since that time, we've been engaging in shaky practices and gimmicky behaviors, deferring pension obligations, borrowing from the capital markets, messing around with the assumed actuarial liabilities or the amortization, which means how much money we need to pay out over time. We've got to stop. We can't, the situation doesn't get better, it just keeps getting worse.
Governor Snyder, this is an international story. Are you concerned now the perception of Detroit, a city in bankruptcy, will damage Michigan as a whole?
Well, it is a challenge. And again, this is not something we want to have happen, and it will cause some issues in terms of perception. But this isn't about public relations. This isn't about politics. This is about doing our job to do the best we can to take care of the 700,000 wonderful people in the city of Detroit. They're my customers. They helped elect me with 9 million other Michiganders. So this is doing the right things by them to say they deserve better services. They deserve a Detroit that's stable and growing in terms of city government. And that's what I'm staying focused on.
And Kevin, quickly, can you tell us what would be the timeline? When do you expect this to start, and when do you expect to come out of it?
Well, the case has started. We anticipate a judge being assigned by the circuit chief within the next day or so, possibly a series of hearings next week as we go forward. But we're trying to get this done, Christy, in a very ambitious timeline, certainly by next fall, next September, from a plan of adjustment and confirmation, because the issues are so extant. They are finite, and they've been coming a long way. This should surprise no one. What we cannot do, and what I pledged to the governor I would do when I got here, is to behave in a very deliberative and open manner and get at this problem as quickly as I could, and that's what we're trying to do.
And you have your work cut out for you. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on MiWeek.
Thank you, Christy.
Thank you.
There is a lot to cover of what this all means. And here with me now are MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, historic day.
Absolutely. Just unbelievable
Yeah.
day in terms of the history of this town and its residents. They've been through a lot over the years, and here we are again.
All right, and so we see the headlines today, headlines that are really all over the world. What can we expect next now, Stephen?
Well, actually, there'll be a little bit of a quiet period for a while they sort out whether we can actually qualify for bankruptcy, and if we do, who is going to be a claimant in that court against our assets. But then after that, I think it'll pick up pretty quickly, and it's going to be frenetic. There are some cardinal fights to be had in this court that will be cases of first impression anywhere in the country for a municipal bankruptcy. There are serious questions here about how you reorganize a city that will set the table for anybody else who ever does this again.
And the difference now is that it moves into a courtroom.
Yeah.
So it moves into the public square, if you will. Up to this point, there's been a lot happening behind the scenes between the governor and Orr, between Orr and the creditors, and now it's going to play out in a courtroom.
In front of everybody.
And is that a good thing, that people will be able to see exactly what we're talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, people need to understand what's going on there, because I'm still not sure folks understand what this all means. And part of the problem is we watched the very dramatic GM and Chrysler bankruptcies, and that was just went smooth. That was an aberration. Bankruptcy does not normally progress like this. This is more likely to be a very messy, very difficult process, and nobody can predict what the end will look like.
And it's really hard to compare what Detroit is going to go through with other Chapter 9s that have happened across the country.
It is. I mean, partially because of the size of this filing. I mean, this is the largest city by far to try to do this, but also because of what Kevin Orr has proposed here, which is a very pretty radical reorganization of the way you deal with creditors. He's also questioning a constitutional protection that we have in Michigan for pensions, and so those two things make this very different, and again, something that no court in the country has had to confront some of these issues.
And Detroit probably should have been in bankruptcy court 10 years ago. I mean, the problem has been allowed to compound. They kept borrowing. They borrowed $130-some million to operate on last year. They've now got $18 billion in debt, and I don't think anybody can say with any certainty that there are $18 billion of assets that the city holds.
Is it also very different from other municipal bankruptcies that you have someone like Kevin Orr who's kind of driving the bus in this situation?
There's no question. I mean, you look at Stockton, California, you look in Jefferson County, Alabama, those places were dealing with mayors and city councils who were trying to reorganize to stay out of bankruptcy and fighting with each other, as they always do, over how to do it. Not sure. They had no experts at the table to try to help them. Here, we've now had Kevin here for 3 months or 4 months, who had the power to sort of put together his own plan, didn't have to fight with anybody about it, and come up with a way to reorganize this thing that now becomes the blueprint for bankruptcy court. That gives us a tremendous advantage over the creditors.
And that's a validation of the emergency manager law, because without that law, this bankruptcy would have been handled by the politicians, the mayor and the
Who
Detroit
made the mess in the
Council.
first place.
And you can imagine that it would not be come out as favorably for the city, because it would be amateurs going up against experts. This guy's as good as it gets.
I was just going to say, you talk about Chapter 9 and the fact that people are finally familiarizing themselves, but when we still don't know exactly how it's going to go, but you finally have the professionals who have the tools to be able to handle this sort of thing. It's complicated.
You have Kevin here, you have Jones Day, who has a guy on their staff named Bruce Bennett, who is a world-renowned restructuring expert. He will be the lead attorney, my understanding is, in the bankruptcy court. They just hired a new CFO, I think is going to be his title, a guy named Jim Bonsell, who comes from Alex Partners, another firm with deep experience in these restructurings. So we've got the A-team representing Detroit in this court. That's not true in Jefferson County, Alabama. That's not true in Stockton, California, and I think it's going to make a difference.
You people talk about, once you finally get to bankruptcy court, it's the judge who's going to be calling a lot of the shots here. Does it matter if the judge is going to be from Michigan or from the circuit?
I don't know. I mean, you would like to think that none of that influences a judge. I don't think we still know yet who the judge is going to be. So it'd be someone within the circuit. Right?
Yeah, well, I talked to Jerry Rosen, who's the chief judge of the Southeastern District Court in Michigan yesterday, about how this works, and it's actually going to be a bankruptcy judge. It will not be one of the Article III judges, federal judges that we have there. We have 5 bankruptcy judges who work full-time in the circuit. One of them has handled a Chapter 9 reorganization already. So he's pretty confident that not only will it stay here, but that it'll get handled properly within the circuit.
So the judge will have a lot to say, but will Kevin Orr also, will the judge defer a lot to Kevin and perhaps his plan?
Well, yeah, I mean, Kevin Orr has taken a fairly extensive outline into this bankruptcy, into this courtroom, and the judge will give a lot of credibility to that plan, and that plan will help guide this process. You know, in a Chapter 9 bankruptcy, Chapter 9 is different than Chapter 11. In Chapter 11, the bankrupt entity can go out of business. The city can't go out of business. And Chapter 9 is designed to help that city come through this, survive, and thrive again. So the creditors are at a lot more disadvantage than they are in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
So it's a little bit more stacked towards the city of Detroit. So let's talk a little bit about the people inside the city who this is going to directly affect. That they've said the city services are expected to almost improve. How does that jive with what you think about bankruptcy?
Well, I mean, if you think about what you do in bankruptcy, you stop paying your creditors, right? Detroit right now is paying, you know, something like 30 cents on every dollar to the people it owes money. You put that back into the pool that you have for services, all of a sudden there's money for more police cars. There's money to try to turn more street
Wait, so
lights
people
on.
will say, I live in a bankrupt city, yet I'm going to get better city services than before a declaration of bankruptcy?
Maybe.
I mean, Kevin Orr is going to try to free up some of that money to do blight remediation, to do better public safety. They're going to try, because part of the long-term solution here is stabilizing the population, stabilizing the city. But no one should think that this is going to be, you know, all good news, all rosy walk in the park. Unexpected things, unpredictable things can happen in a bankruptcy court, and people should be prepared for some real shocks.
Like what?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the creditors will challenge what Kevin's trying to do. And they'll say, no, you can't keep that money, and no, you can't even withhold the money that you've promised while the bankruptcy goes on. The settlement we saw earlier this week with Bank of America and some other creditors over the casino revenues was a huge win for Kevin Orr, in the sense that now the city will get to keep those dollars and put them into services, as opposed to paying them or having a creditor sort of hold on to them as you know, a hedge against the city's default. That's also a huge win in the sense that it sets an important precedent. That's a big creditor that he has a deal with to take 75 cents on the dollar, that's a secured creditor taking a haircut, that also becomes predicate for the other discussions in bankruptcy court about what everybody else gets. Almost all of the cards at this point are in Kevin's hands. The creditors are going to have a very tough time in bankruptcy court fighting him with the judge.
And Kevin has said that Detroit is a unique situation, that perhaps, what happens here in this situation you can't quite put into other areas of the country. But don't you think other cities are going to be watching this and saying, hey, if this happened this way in Detroit, we can make this happen here?
And that's why the creditors were reluctant to make the deal he offered. He can say it's not Detroit's unique, and it certainly is, and it's not going to set a precedent. I don't think that's true. I think other municipalities with heavy debt that they can't meet, we're watching what the creditors did in Detroit, and you can bet if they gave Detroit this voluntarily, that's what was going to be on the table in other places. They took their chance now. They're taking their chance in bankruptcy court, where it's more of an individual assessment of what what the resources are against what's owed, and the dollar amounts won't necessarily set precedents there.
All right, so let's talk about what's owed. Let's talk about the people who get pensions from the city of Detroit. What is going to happen in that situation?
Well, that's
I don't
one
think
of the
anybody
things that
knows.
surprising.
I don't think anyone knows, and I don't think Kevin Orr knows for sure what needs to be done.
But if you're sitting there and you were opening up your newspaper or watching the news today and you
worried.
see Detroit declares bankruptcy and you're getting a pension,
Yes.
what do you expect now?
I think you have to be reasonably worried that that pension may change, and may change dramatically. When he was with us a couple weeks ago on this show, though, we talked about that, and he talked about how one of the things he wants to be able to do is to tier the effects of this, right? So nobody wants to see a 72-year-old
It's not all of a sudden going to go to nothing.
lose their check, because what opportunity does that person have to go out and make money on their own? But we have a lot of 48-year-old, 55-year-old retirees in the city of Detroit who may be asked to supplement their own income. These are people who, by any reasonable measure, should probably still be working anyway, even if they're not in their primary jobs. I think if he can weight the effects away from the most vulnerable, it's gonna be more acceptable.
And in court, he may try to leverage the pensions against health care savings, so that if he can save enough in health care, he can leave the pensions alone. Now, you're asking a retiree to pay more of the health care, that's still a loss of income. But I think his hope was that perhaps the federal Obamacare would help mitigate some of that impact.
And the health exchanges. If you are the folks at the DIA this morning with this announcement, what are their thoughts in terms of assets and possible sales?
I mean, I don't know that we know the answer to that, and I think they got very smug over the last couple of years over there and saying, well, nobody had ever touched this, you can't touch it, and instead of taking steps to protect their assets, they left them vulnerable. I think it's another one of those unpredictable situations in bankruptcy court. Anything could happen.
Is there anything the DIA could have done?
Well, I mean, everyone says they could have protected their assets, but their assets are very complicated. They don't own all of that stuff outright. Some of the stuff that they do own outright has contingencies on it, so if you did sell it, it would go back to the original person anyway. I think the smartest thing to have done would have been to get an actual valuation of the collection, and to sort of put into black and white what's available and what's not, what's vulnerable and what's not. I think if the creditors want to go after the DIA, they're in for years of litigation.
But they could have severed the ownership from the city of Detroit. When they moved the DIA to a separate independent authority, they could have severed the ownership.
See, I think if you had raised that, I mean, people cried bloody murder from just at the idea of management moving away from the city. That literally would have been stripping the city of that asset. Joanne Watson would have had a field day.
But nobody's talking about selling polar bears and beavers out at the zoo,
because they took
that
money
step.
for them.
It's not a Van Gogh,
You're
right?
not going to keep that polar bear in your backyard.
I would come visit, though. I would say that. Okay,
No one would shoot the polar bear.
But let's talk about assets. The city, $18 billion, rounding towards $20 billion. Does the city even have anything that would even equal half of that?
No.
I don't think so. I think you could take everything the city owns, put it in a big pile, auction it off, and it wouldn't come anywhere near that amount. That's what's so startling about the amount of money they were able to borrow. And a lot of that rests with the state over the years. The state should have never approved this sort of
Yeah, there are other states, I mean, and southern states which have very different relationships with municipalities than states like Michigan and Illinois and Ohio, keep much tighter rein over finances. In North Carolina, for example, if a city doesn't maintain a 15% of their overall budget in fund balance for more than like 6 months, the state comes in and runs it. I mean, we haven't done that in Detroit in 50 years. So there's no question that the way we have managed municipalities in this state is part of the big problem.
Yeah, I mean, right now we wait until it's a complete meltdown, and then the state
And
gets
then they
in.
come in.
It would be nice if there were procedures well up the line to head off the disaster.
A little bit of a graduated effect. All right, so we've talked about how this is going to impact Detroit. Let's talk about how bankruptcy for Detroit is going to impact Michigan. What are we going to see?
I would assume you're going to see downgrades on the state's debt. The state's credit rating has been marching steadily upward under Rick Snyder's leadership. Oakland County faces the same thing, a sterling bond rating there. Brooks has said, gosh, I'm worried about the impact. I think it's inevitable that the debt ratings are going to go down across Michigan. The other worry is, how do you market a city, a region, a state, when through this bankruptcy process? And I do believe that's something the governor's going to have to give a lot of attention to, how you mitigate the damage of this thing.
Yeah, this is a big PR problem. I mean, when you have these international headlines on the front of the USA Today was, Motown goes bust. And, you've got the Pure Michigan campaign that's working overtime. You have a lot of the good news stories that are happening in Midtown and in downtown and the development, and not to mention all the real estate that Dan Gilbert is buying up every single day. So how do you quantify that? I mean, how do you balance that?
Well, I mean, it's a balance that will play itself out over time, right? I mean, the only thing holding us back, frankly, right now in Detroit is this governance problem, right? The lack of stable governance, the lack of stable financial management. The governor deserves credit for taking that on in a way that no governor before him chose to do. If you fix that, I think the things that we're seeing in Midtown and downtown with stable governance could translate into a much bigger turnaround for this area than we've seen.
But if you look at what we've been seeing over the last few weeks, we printed a roundup in Thursday's newspaper of stories from around the country.
How other people perceive us.
And suddenly, instead of talking about all those cool new kids in lofts downtown and, Gilbert doing this and Gilbert doing that, it was a reminder of the 80,000 blighted building, the hour wait for EMS and COP. It was really focusing on the horrible things that are going on.
And that'll
in
hurt
Detroit.
us.
Yeah.
And that's going to go on for a while.
And I was going
now.
to say, I mean, is it going to hurt us for the next 5 years or so, or however long it takes us to?
I hope it won't.
It'll hurt us a
Tremendous.
little bit, but I mean, we also have to start learning here to look at the advantages we have and the assets that we do have. I mean, our geography alone puts us in much better stead than most big cities. I mean, we are really the only great international crossing between Chicago and Montreal, two places that are going to do huge trade over the next 10, 15, 20 years. If we can start to capitalize on things like that, get a new bridge built, start taking advantage of the rail connections and this wonderful airport that we've built that has amazing freight possibilities, now we can start to see regrowing not just Detroit, but the whole region in a way that no one necessarily thought was possible. But this is a hurdle we got to get over. It's a little hurdle we got to get over first, which is get through the bankruptcy.
That's a big hurdle.
It's a big hurdle.
In that context, I think it's a little.
But we can't let it stop. I mean, the good things that are on track, we can't let it stop. The new bridge, the M1 rail, the Hockeytown
Possible new arena,
development.
right.
All of those things need to progress, and I think if they do, people will relax a little. But if suddenly you start seeing those major projects on hold,
we're
I
in
think
some
it becomes a real hard thing.
Okay, so how would you guys put today's headline in perspective as newspapermen over the last 30, 50 years here in the city of Detroit? Would you say that this is the biggest story?
It's one of them.
It's the biggest story I've ever been part of. I mean, the immediate comparison, I suppose, is to the Kilpatrick text message scandal in 2007 or 8, which was a huge story, but it really didn't have the impact that this did. That was a political scandal. This is about, you know, the entire region and state. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what would be bigger.
Well, we've had a lot of big stories in this town. I mean, that's one of the reasons we stay here. I mean, it's been a great news town. I would agree that the Kilpatrick scandal was a sexier story. I'm not sure it was a bigger story in terms of its impact. You know, the Detroit or the GM Chrysler bankruptcies. In many ways, those companies were bigger and more important to Michigan than Detroit is. But that sort of was, the way it was handled was so predetermined. This is a bigger story in the unpredictability of it. So we sit here and talk about what we think is going to happen next. We don't know.
Nobody knows.
And nobody knows. The governor and Kevin Orr don't know. So, yeah, I think it's one of the biggest I've been involved with.
Well, it's history in the making. And of course, we will have much more to talk about in the coming weeks. Plus, we will get back to some of the debates in Lansing surrounding Common Core standards and struggling school districts next week. But that is going to do it for MiWeek tonight. Make sure you go to MiWeek.org and catch up on the shows, or share the shows with your friends on Facebook and on Twitter so they can see what MiWeek is all about. For all of us at Detroit Public TV, I'm Christy McDonald. We hope you've had a good week. Come back and see us next Friday for MiWeek.
Business Leaders for Michigan is dedicated to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and economic growth. Learn more at businessleadersformichigan.com. Funding is also provided by Delta,